Welcome to the Fuel the Fight podcast. I am Lieutenant Colonel Nick Behringer, and we have a special guest today, Dr. Ed Thomas, going to share a lot about military and fitness and how we got to the point where we are and some of the things that might be lost. Ed, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm glad to be here, sir.
One of the things I wanted to ask about is your Army story, because you served, was it during the Vietnam era or immediately post-Vietnam era?
Yeah, I was on a wrestling scholarship down in Kirksville, Missouri, 1967. The war was heating up, and I didn't have to go. I wasn't going to be drafted, but I grew up after the end of World War II, and so I've been surrounded by military guys all my life, and I knew that if someday if war came, it was my responsibility. I just had to go, and so I quit college and I volunteered for the draft, and I volunteered for the infantry, and I got out of cycle because they sent me to some leadership school, and so then I was sent down to Fort Stewart, and we were attached to some special forces unit, and we were the bad guys in a escape and evasion course. So I lived in the swamp down there. And I knew I wanted to go to Vietnam. I kept 1049 and trying to get there, and finally got orders for Vietnam. I felt ready because I've been training for over a year. And the Pueblo hit, and all of our orders were rescinded, and we were shipped off to the DMZ of South Korea, because what happened was we had convinced the Koreans to send the Light Horse and the Tiger Division over to Vietnam. So the North Koreans started sending all these elite soldiers over. And I spent 6 months up there, and then the last 6 months we moved south. I was with the 7th ID. I was NCOIC of a gym. Can you believe it? What a wonderful job. You know, I lived in it, so I trained all day. We had the best martial artists up there. I brought guys in from the judo college. I'd been practicing judo since I was in high school, and I was all ready. So I was able to sent the houseboy down to the Ville and got some steroids, brought some Bistanabol back. Before I went over at Fort Stewart, a bunch of us just went over to the doctor, the medical doctor there on post, and he gave us Dianabol. It was legal back then. We didn't know anything.
Wow.
Got a little edgy. Yeah, but I knew I was just gonna lose a lot of weight and get eaten up. So I thought I better put on as much muscle as I can, and it paid off. But I never used it after that. But yeah, I bulked up, and 6 months later, then I came back and went back to college and went to the University of Iowa. I didn't realize it, but I was studying under the students of a guy named Charles McCloy, who was one of the pioneers of the 1945 Army Physical Training Doctrine, one of the writers of the manual and advised the Navy. He was one of the leaders in the field of anthropometry, which is test measurement. All the confusion you're having now with the test comes out of I think probably the loss of that wisdom these guys had. These were masters of test and measurement. The World War II guys, my generation, we were amateurs at it. But anyway, they're throwing all of his stuff away. I grab all that, and now I'm up to my ankles here in military fitness again. And then I'm teaching judo and hatha yoga and weight training at the U of Iowa back then in the PE department, because nobody wanted to teach that stuff. There was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment left over from the war back then, and so martial arts were, and then nobody believed in weight training back then. The weight room was filthy. We had an old vent bar. That was 1969. Things have changed a lot since then. But yeah, so I was practicing all these concepts. Then I was swept up in hatha yoga. I had hair down to my backside a couple of years after I got out of the Army. So I was assigned to teach hatha yoga. Now I'm down that road, and it took me all over the world, monasteries, ashrams, because I ended up teaching all that stuff. In 1980, I was brought into Task Force Delta. That was that Men Who Stare at Goats organization. Some captain grabbed me and reached out and said, "We'd like you to join this organization." That's a whole other discussion, but that's a fascinating discussion of what they figured out and what they didn't figure out. So I was back in the Army. And then I was at Fort Benning all through the 90s. I was started at the fitness school. I got myself a job down there. See, when the wall went down in '89, I figured all this stuff I learned, because I trained in that old German system, the old Turners, where the Army got all of its physical education. I figured all that stuff was going to come back when the wall went down, because we quit using it in 1920. The East Europeans, the Russians, I figured it would come out as equipment. So it came out as the kettlebell, med balls, all this stuff, off the ground training eventually. But all of that had been highly developed prior to 1920 in the USA. So I figured it was going to come back. And I packed up this Ryder truck full of med balls and all the stuff the Army wasn't using at the time. That was in 93. Got myself a job at the fitness school. And I became a doctrine writer. And all of a sudden, when I got there, they were trying to introduce butt floss aerobics across the Army. Here, think Jane Fonda. That's how crazy it was in 92. That's another story but thank God it got back to Fort Benning. It used to be at Benning. The doctrine used to be out of Building 4.
Right, the infantry.
Yeah, after Vietnam, we demilitarized. We got rid of the hand-to-hand. We got rid of the bayonet. And then we moved it up to Fort Ben Harrison to open the fitness school. They threw all the old manuals. In fact, I got the old manuals. They gave them all the old manuals they had. And they started this MFT course. And the Army figured out, hey, wait, this isn't working. Got to go back to Benning in 93. Smart move. And I still think we were ahead of the civilian sector in all this, by the way. The civilian sector was even more lost back then. But the wall went down in 89, so I moved down there. And it's a long story. I went down there with a hidden agenda. I figured the unguarded gate in all of this is off-duty education. Doctrine's flat. You can't get in. It's the Bible. The rec centers were still sport-oriented. We were still doing Nautilus. I figured, why not off-duty education? So we went down there, convinced the post to develop a 4-year degree in warrior-based physical training. I don't know if you knew this or not. A bachelor's degree, off-duty ed, right next to 75th Rangers. So who do we get? Guys like Jeff Struker, Matt Larson took courses. These are the best and the brightest. And imagine we laid out every manual back to I've got all the manuals back to the 1890s. Every PT manual that's ever been published, some that haven't, laid them all out on the table, and stuff that had never been seen, gave it to these guys, say, compare what they were doing to what we're doing, and go back to your unit and explore options. And that's when the worm turned in Army fitness. By 98, the fitness school said, hey, come back to the fitness school, work for us again. You're embarrassing us. Because these guys we were free to think. You know, it was education. And we were making the New York Times, Army Times. Then I was writing all this propaganda stuff, quoting everybody to make sure they were in it. And it really made a difference. I think it all got lost probably around 2001 was in the degree program went flat around 98. That's a long story, but it showed what you could do by looking at all the history. And that was just anyway, yeah, there were guys like Stan McChrystal. He was he helped us set it up, and Colonel Puckett. He briefed him once. He said, he said, I've waited a long time to hear a brief like this, because it was all the stuff that they did when he was in. And he remembered a lot of this World War II and Korean War training. And there's other stuff that I could tell you about the Army. But yeah, that's basically the Army story.
And I'll put in the show links, because you share a lot of great videos of this, and you can see what you're talking about. I watched that link you sent to me, and I mean those names that you mentioned, just for those not aware, is like Jeff Struker, Black Hawk Down, became a chaplain, is now highly influential as a chaplain, and doing those things. You have Matt Larson. Went on to become the father of modern Army combatives, runs the combatives at the West Point program, obviously General McChrystal and all he's done. And then, Colonel Puckett, Medal of Honor winner now, and all the great things. So a lot of legends you mentioned there. So, one of the things is you mentioned like the history of physical training and all, So the Army, it sounds like we got it wrong, or from your take or opinion, when we moved fitness away from the infantry school. Was that kind of the issue, is when we separated fitness from combat proficiency, would you say?
Yeah, that was one of those little spikes on the radar history. The 1885 until 1920 is surprisingly the golden era of American U.S. Army physical training. And that was out of West Point. We had a second generation German called by the name of Hermann Keller, Kohler, whoever you ask. You've been there, the West Point, Keller Gym. And he was a German turner, another guy that trained in the old German Turnverein. And that system then began to fade. And what happened was the United States began to disown those systems and focus on a more Darwinian notion of sports. So we gave up the Greek ideal of the warrior philosopher in favor of Darwinian animal fighting and who can win. And this happened in the civilian sector, but it's civilians who eventually put on the uniform. So it spread into the Army. When Herman Keller left West Point, we began to see more sports and games take over. Well, those people who were kids then during those years, all through the 20s and 30s, they were just oddballs, militant physical educators, they called them. Sports and games, you guys, you militaristics, fascists, all you guys that want to do all these calisthenic and all this stuff, all that became vilified. But when the war came along and we realized, we're not ready, and the bad guys have been practicing. I don't know if you've heard of Bob Hoffman, Strength and Health magazine, the York Barbell Company. Well, he was a World War I vet, and he wrote a book called I Remember the Last War. He used Strength and Health magazine to warn us that he was the first Olympic weightlifting coach. This is a pioneer in the area of weightlifting, real functional weightlifting. And he was warning us. He said, the Germans are coming, the Japanese are coming. He's warning us in those magazines. And all the way into the 60s, he's doing articles about colleges that use weightlifting because the scientists back then were against it. They said it'll make you muscle bound. But the Army then got a great spurt of energy between 41 and the end of World War II because those militant guys had a voice again. After the war, starting in around 45, up until the old timers retired. I went in 67. We were still using the 57 manual FM 2120. 46 and 57 were never again manuals. We're not going to let this happen again. Korea didn't go well in terms of fitness. So that new manual came out. They said, we're going to start fixing it. But the new manual, the 63, I think it was, you can just see slowly starting to become less relevant. And it's just the ebb and flow of time. But I look at today as a great opportunity because when that wall went down and we got back the equipment, there are three considerations now the Army has to look at: methods, materials, and motivators. All you have now are the materials again. People laughed at med balls when I used them. Indian clubs, kettlebell, all this stuff, weighted bars. I used it all. I taught it at universities. I got in trouble. I was a militant physical educator and always stayed at the bottom of the hierarchy because I thought that way. But now the Army's got all this stuff. I think what you have to do is go back now and look at the methods. How did they teach it? Right now, we teach soldiers no differently, and no disrespect to the Army. I'm simply saying it's an opportunity once we see it. We began teaching people like animals, I'm guessing in the 60s, when the discipline movement began. The discipline movement in PE was an attempt to make us look smarter and learn more, so we became scientists. We disassociate ourselves from the sports. We opened up these exercise science and motor learning, and I forget the other ones, biomechanics, started cranking out PhDs and all of that. Well, once again, we weren't focused on the hands-on stuff. That was left to the graduate assistants and whatever. So right now, we have an opportunity across the board if we look at the teaching methods. And and also the motivators. Now, there are three motivators. There's self. Maslow gives us this: self, others, and transcendence. So in other words, for the child, the body's a toy. You play with it, you break it, you do stupid things with it, and then you become an adult, for maybe an athlete or a soldier. Your body becomes a tool, and you're responsible for taking care of it the same way you would your tools. I remember guys getting Article 15 is for getting sunburned. I don't know if they do that anymore in the Army. They give you a friggin', because it would lose a guy, and we couldn't afford to lose a guy. So your body becomes a tool. You have to take care of it. Then when you start getting really old, then your body becomes a temple. Now you realize that it's a temporary, it's what Plato called the man of silver, the warrior monk, the warrior philosopher, philosophia, the lover of wisdom. You begin to realize that there's a whole other reason I'm taking care of my body, and that's because it is a temple. That's something that the thinkers in the Army have to think about, and that takes you to social psychology and how do you train a whole bunch of people at one time to do things efficiently, and that's called social psychology. It's Henry Floyd Allport wrote it's called social facilitation. Under certain conditions, a group of people will learn faster, run harder, live better, but under other conditions, that group, doing it in a group will impair performance. The trick is to figure out what are those optimal conditions that will give you the optimal learning conditions.
Well, kind of pulling on that, Ed, is how did you do what you did at Benning? Because, I do want to take a step back and come back to that because, I mean, that's pretty wild that you showed up at Fort Benning with your medicine balls and all this stuff that nobody was doing. And then having served in the regiment, I know that's a tough culture to break into. That's a natural, especially for an outsider. It's a skeptical population. It's an educated population. And, they probably didn't say, Ed, come here with these, with your Indian clubs and all these things. Come in and Rangers are going to do it. So the fact that, and I'll, again, the people who are listening to this, you have to watch these videos I'm going to put in the link. I mean, you had huge formations out there, and you could tell back then by the distinctive haircut, a lot of them Rangers doing these movements. Like, how did you get that buy-in? Like, how did you do that? Like, what, magic did you work there?
Well, it's really surprising because I was already old when I got there. I mean, I'm old as coal now, but I was still old, and I'm only about 4 feet tall. And a little guy with a little beard and, all these friggin' super studs. And, I was mildly amused at myself occasionally. I think part of it was the ability to lead from the front. You've been there. It would be one thing if I was overweight and telling people what to do, but I never quit doing it. I just was driven and I taught all my life. So these movements and all this stuff that I could get up and do it. And now I think that's why Herman Curler was successful at West Point, because even into his 50s, you could see this guy was still doing it. And I think then they looked at this and said, holy cow. And I wish I could do that. I wish I could physically do that. And a lot of them could. But we had to take it one step further. I said to these guys, hey, you have to learn how to teach it. Not only that, you have to learn how to teach somebody to teach it. You've got to be able to pass this stuff down, or it doesn't mean anything. You're just an army of one. That didn't work. So I never told them what to do. I laid the stuff out on the table. This is a whole degree. Imagine taking 2 courses a semester at night. And the fitness school helped on this one. But I think it was also guys like Sergeant Major Acebes, I think Ranger Hall of Fame. He was our post sergeant major. I think all of them got it because I wasn't saying it's my stuff. I'm saying just look in these manuals, look into the lives of these guys and how they did it, then go see. And that was how easy it was. A lot of the stuff you're doing on the PT test is funny because like the overhead toss, that all began. See, the med ball came along in the early 90s. It was called the OOF ball. A nurse and her husband made it. Beautiful ball. They don't make them anymore. Unbelievable. I still got a bunch of them. And but the guy had this game we started playing with kids at risk called OOF ball, where you throw it over a volleyball net, and when you catch it, they go oof. And he got it from President Hoover. Played it. It was called the Hoover ball, and he got it from sailors somewhere on a ship. So basically, you're playing like tennis or volleyball with a med ball, and then they started throwing it overhead. And the reason I told them to do that, but first we had to go back and teach them how to do it. The reason they throw overhead is because, first of all, it helps align the shoulders. More importantly, they're all prekyphotic. I think I mentioned, I didn't mention this to you. Here in Iowa, I was in charge of all of the PE for the state of Iowa, 2001 to 2013, I think, or 14. About 95% of our kids, every one of them, will be physically deformed no later than the end of second grade. I'll be able to show you the deformity by the end of second grade, and they didn't have it going into school, and they'll have it much worse when they graduate, and they'll have it when they go into the Army. And it will impair their structure, their function, and their motion. The exercise that we are doing initially with these trainees should be preconditioning, is what the Army used to call it. It should be to fix the structure, function, and motion. And that's why, another reason why we were successful is that we quit working out. I told them, quit working out. You don't have to. I never worked out in my life, but I go to learn. I'm going to go to learn to do something. I'll work my ass off. You know, you're going to be tired when you sleep tonight, but I'm not going. Who wants to work? Even the word is offensive. And that goes back to the Darwinian notion of training animals. You know, we're not, we have to think about training ourselves as human beings. And we need to be testing motor fitness at least as much as physical fitness. So the doctrine went adrift, and then the test went the other way. So the test is unaligned with the doctrine, just like the PT is unaligned with the combatives. So in 46, the combatives and the PT were all in the same book. In other words, if I'm learning to do some skill, if I'm learning to do a calisthenic movement, it must lead to a more complex movement in drill number 2, which must lead to a more complex movement. Then it leads to a grass drill, a gorilla drill, then it leads to blah, 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 all the different motor skills. So we think it in terms of combat skill acquisition, then fitness are simply the tools we have, but the motor skills are the building blocks. This is what we built.
This is why I love talking to you. I learn something every time I talk to you. And so, you know, you're saying, okay, yeah, the PT is supposed to train for a larger motor skill. So if I hear you right, you know, I remember talking to Matt Larson about this, how combative should be in the fitness doctrine. And I agree. That's my opinion, you know. Yeah. So if we're training to, you know, extend our legs or to drive into the ground, that should eventually lead to a double leg takedown. Or is that kind of what you're saying? Is like, we're doing all these leg strengthening exercises, but it's got to lead to a higher motor level skill kind of at the end of the tunnel. Is that? Yeah.
Well, like Thomas Curtin is a father of physical fitness in PE. World War II guy again. Amazing. Warfare Aquatics, if you ever get the book, blow your mind. But he said you measure fitness in 3 ways: structure, function, and motion. You have to measure all 3. So what's structure? Posture, alignment, proportion, symmetry. As soon as a soldier comes in, we ought to be looking at their posture. If they don't see some structural improvement at the end of AIT or basic training, we failed them, because they're going to be worse off. They're not going to be the same. So what do we do about that? Number one, it's the type of training we do. I just saw that I just read it in the paper yesterday at mill.com or military.com. The Army's going to quit screaming at soldiers and just give them tougher PT. Just read that. Got it. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. So it's got to be smarter physical training. Think of what I used to tell the students, undergrads, is that think of your body as the most complicated city in the world, with a gazillion streets and trillions and trillions of intersections. And you're in a hurry, and you've got to get from up here all the way to the tip of your toe. And you make one wrong turn at some synapse, you're going to end up off in your hand, or your tongue's going to stick out. And so you got to be able to trace those neural highways. And by the way, then it's got to go all the way back and tell you whether you did it or not. So how do you do that in a body in a city that's been demoralized? All the streets are screwed up. You got to fix the structure, and then you got to fix the function. Well, structure. Let's say the child's been sitting at a 90-degree hip angle on a flat desk, which they have, and they can't see what they're writing, so they turn the paper to the side. Now they've rotated in hyperflexion. The lumbar curve's out the back door. They can't breathe properly. The organs aren't functioning well. And by the way, they have permanent forward neck that'll keep growing. Well, how in the hell do you get them to do anything? And that's what we're facing. There's a guy, his name, and if some of your listeners want it, because this stuff's good to know. Daryl Boyd Harmon, he died in 75. There's a guy by the name of A.C. Mandel, ACMANDIL.com. A.C. Mandel did the research on the optimal position angle of the hip when you're sitting for any amount of time. Horse riding angle. At a horse riding angle, the lumbar curve is restored. The upper body shoots up into an upright position. Why equestrians have such great posture, because they're training their core all day. And then this other fellow I mentioned, Daryl Boyd Harmon, he was an expert in vision and reading. I think he says around a 22-degree angle on the desk if you're reading. If you're typing, you want a 60-degree hip angle, and you want your forearms to be exactly parallel to the ground, or you're going to contort your wrist in order to type on the keyboard. So none of this. I think if you look online, you find desk angle stuff. You can find. I use a simple thing here called. I'm using this today, just called disco sit, and you see it don't inflate it very much, and what it gives you is a little dome. So what you do circles, figure eights, and you don't have to think a bit. It's like you've been riding a friggin' horse all day. Now imagine putting your trainees in those solid sitting positions, and they won't even have to work at it. They're not even, all you got to do is model it. Make sure the drill sergeants understand. Much of what we do today, I don't think what we used to even call it back in the 60s. We used to call the stuff that we see today gorilloid postures and gorilloid gaits. I mean, people would be insulted these days. You can't get away with it. But what it is, it would look to the old timers as more like a primate sits, not like a human sits. Isn't that interesting?
Very interesting.
Yeah. So those are the types of things that we were introducing down at Fort Benning, which were off the chart. And then what came along? Saddle chairs, ball chairs, all these different 60-degree hip angle chairs. It's all out there now. We're just not experimenting with it in the military environment yet. More importantly, we're not really sure what to do. We went through a lot of mechanics on the thing, but you got to teach a trainee how to use the stuff.
So yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't even know. I'll have to look at that hip ankle. So maybe we should have some sort of, now we do have more standing desks. I will say that I've seen that across the military, but a saddle chair when we're doing these big class settings where people are going to be sitting down, it's more in a saddle position would be more optimal for the hips in terms of that than just your typical classroom chair.
So this stuff is now mainstream. Mm-hmm. It's not out of the lane anymore. So it's something we can, and all the research is out there for us to see. acmandel.com's got a nice piece online about hip angle, and there's plenty of stuff about it. The main thing is, I think, to explain it to the soldier in such a way. Okay, why are you doing this? You have what are called hip flexors. If they get tight, what's going to happen to the pelvis? It's going to tip downward. So what's going to happen to the internal organs? They're going to fall downward and forward. And it has a name, viscerotosis, falling organs. And what's it take with us? Oh, just the diaphragm, the heart, the lungs, everything gets minutely stretched all the way up to the cervical tendons. Everything gets deformed by the end of each day for a little child who grows up sitting at a 90-degree hyperflex. It's kid-sized tiger cage thinking. And it all started 1945, we had slanted desks. 63, we still had them. 72, the people in charge of that knowledge all faded away. I guess that's an easy way to put it. All those old timers, you look at when they passed away, all in the 70s. And now we're just rediscovering. The Scandinavians have known about the hip angle thing. The Japanese, I've had a Japanese seiza bench since the 70s. That's just the way to kneel it at 60-degree hip. So it's kind of it's a tangent, but it represents one of those old ideas that make a lot of sense for the future, and people have done a lot of work to help us rediscover them. We just have to experiment with it now and see how to use it.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I'll put that in the show notes. One of the other things people, has kind of gotten forgotten about, and you personally, I mean, have brought back, because whenever I Google anything with Indian clubs, like your name is at the top of the list. Could you talk a little bit about Indian clubs and their history and why they're forgotten, and then kind of how you've helped to give them a bit of a resurgence?
Yeah, I started training in Indian clubs in the old German Turnverein system. I was about 9 years old, and from the old timers, we had some great club swinging teachers here in Davenport, Iowa, and they were an Olympic event, 1904, 1932.
Did not know that.
Yeah, and Herman Kerler introduced them to the U.S. Army in 1885, but I've seen pictures where they appear to have been there earlier. So it looks like, I don't know how old the picture is, but definitely they were a part of the Army doctrine all the way up until World War II, maybe a little later, but all the teachers died. The Indian clubs were another casualty. The battle of the systems. The Germans, the Swedes, the French, the Czech, the Swiss, the French, they all brought their systems over to the USA, gymnastic systems. And they're all fighting for supremacy in this new field called PE. They all wanted a chunk of it. The Army took the German. So they adopt the clubs, the Germans. And I'm training in these things, but they all died away. Nobody wanted to learn them. So I'm using this, med balls, all this old stuff, all my career. And nobody wanted to learn it. And I didn't have any. You couldn't get them. So one day I found about 100 sets of clubs, antique, over at the University of Iowa in an attic, and they gave them to me. Now I had enough clubs to start teaching it. That was 81, 82, maybe 83. That was the rediscovery of Indian clubs in the United States. And then when I got to Benning, still had the clubs, and the guy started using them. Well, the females too. They realized, wow, this is powerful stuff. You see a lot of Indian club stuff online today where they're just kind of swinging them, whatever comes up. But when you see it as it's done, think of a ball and socket joint right here, an extension of this one, and then another one and another one. So you're adding one more ball and socket, and you're putting the weight out here. And now you start swinging this thing in all these beautiful patterns, keeping your wrist straight and your knuckles flat. All these various neural patterns that awaken, that it's like the alphabet of everything your shoulder can do. Because the shoulder girdle moves in all these rotational patterns. The club is all rotational. So it not only cleans the joints up, but it teaches all these joints how to talk to one another. Then when you start moving your feet, then you realize why the Indian warriors were using them as weapons. But there's also a mystical component, because they're found in the hands of the Vedic gods. And the Greek, the Hercules, they're all using their clubs. Here you see all these mystical Vedic deities saying there's something about moving your body in all these circles. And after practicing for 70 years or so, I'm sure there's something to it. I think it's had a lot to do with staying mobile and upright it's really beautiful when you do it as a group. There's a power in the rhythm. There's a power in all of that you see. Yeah. If they go to, listeners, go to the channel, the Via Militaris, they can see some of the military images of soldiers doing it.
Yeah, no, I'll link that video. I think you guys are in front of Building 4, and everybody's doing the Indie clubs. It looks great. Well, and then there's a restorative component that I want you to talk about, because one of the things I read, I know this was years ago, but one of the pioneers of mixed martial arts, Pat Militech, I think he had a bunch of shoulder injuries from fighting and all like that. And didn't you work with him in the clubs? And he said that gave his range of motion back.
But yeah, back then, none of this stuff was known when I first met him. All this stuff was brand new, and I showed him how to use the clubs. And one thing about Pat is that he was very, very technique oriented. So he paid attention, didn't go too heavy, just stayed. The club is helping you create this pull away from the body, the centrifugal force. And so if you have too much, then you're going to lose the technical quality. You're going to maladapt or whatever. So you got to find just the right weight to start pulling that stuff in all these directions. because you're pulling it it's like you're in the middle of a ball and you're awakened in all these various directions. Well, he was good at that. I could tell by just watching him that he was going to be really good. And
so for that, and I love the pulling. I've never thought about that when I do it. Is there a weight you recommend? Because you can get them in all sorts of different weights. Is there a weight, for people who want to start out, and then maybe people who've been training a while? Like what's the weight?
Yeah, maybe one or no more than 1.5 pounds for anybody up to 150, 60, even 70, because you want just enough because there's so much tension in there. There's so much there's just so many years of abuse that we've taken from childhood on, and you just got to ease that open. And so 2 pounds, and I might still have a 8 or 12 pound pair somewhere, but 5 pounds is all I'll ever use, because I don't want to lose the speed. I want to be able to use it like a weapon if I have to. And the movements are larger than Kali, or larger than knife fighting. That's what's giving you the mobility. And then, of course, I train upside down. I train in all kinds of various positions. Once with students, once we work for a while, then I'll start moving them spatially so they can get the vestibular function back in order.
Nice. For anybody listening to this, they're like, I have no idea about Indian clubs. Is there a reference that I could recommend or drop in the show notes?
Yeah, I made a video when I was down at Fort Benning, I think it was. If you go to YouTube channel, Via Militaris, all one word. Yeah,
I'll put it in there.
Yeah, VIAMILITRS. And then go to the Indian Clubs Iowa. There's a tutorial.
Okay.
And if they have any questions, I don't mind answering emails if it's about physical training or such. You can give them my email address too. But yeah, it's something you'll be able to do not just now, but you can do it all your life. And it's not, you should never come away tired. It's called neural training. It's training that highway. Somewhere on my channel, I have a clip called Tolympics. I learned to do it when I was a kid. I weaponized everything when I was a little boy, and marbles were everywhere because we had dirt. We didn't have grass. So I'd pick the marble up with my feet and I'd shoot it. And I got really good at shooting the marble with my toes. And it turns out that they're front kicks and push kicks. I didn't realize it at the time. So now I put up there, I used to teach kids to do it. So you pick up the marble and you shoot it at a target. You do it laterally, you can shoot, you can do a nice trajectory. Well, you're sending a message, the longest message you'll ever send on the neural highway, from the brain to the tip of your toe. And the ability to wake up your feet has so much to do with your ability to wake up the legs. Because our feet go dead early on in life. Our shoes are abusive, they're too narrow, they don't bend. Combat boots take their toll, work boots. So taking our shoes off at night isn't enough to fix that. There's got to be something to fix them. And it's just another example of neural training. Your brain will be fried. You won't go home sore, but your brain will be sore because you're creating these neural pathways.
No, thanks for sharing that. One of the kind of last concepts I wanted to talk to you about is the inversion. You mentioned there getting inversion, because that was another thing you really introduced in the military. And if you watch the videos when you're working with Rangers, you see getting all these Rangers upside down, hooking into the pull-up bars, and that's something I haven't seen since. Like, that really has went away in terms of, I don't see a lot of people inverting. Can you talk about where that comes from and why we should be doing that?
Yeah. I used to go out to a place called Gold's Gym in the summer. I was teaching weight training at U of Iowa and felt incompetent. So I'd haul ass out there, and there were guys like Dave Draper and Frank Zane and Franco Colombo. One day I saw Frank Zane and Colombo on these boots, and I was already using a primitive inversion table when I was teaching yoga. Just intuitively, I understood somehow that being upside down was important. And I grew up in the Turner Society, so we were always upside down training. But so I was there and I saw him, and Colombo. I asked Franco Colombo. I said, "Where'd you get these boots?" And he said, "The guy that invented them is over in Pasadena." So I went right over. Turns out the guy, his name was Dr. R.M. Martin. and he was a chiropractor, an osteopath, and an MD, and he grew up not far from me here in Pella, Iowa, and we were at the same weight, same height, and he grew up 20 years earlier in the German Turners. And he was a vaudeville gymnast. His father was a chiropractor. He was a Pilates. He was that type of genius, and he created equipment. He said, "Look, okay." He moved out to California because he got involved in the bodybuilding community because it was more restorative back in the 60s with Hoffman and those guys. So anyway, he says, okay, you got 6 basic postural categories in which your body can reside. So posture means any position in which the body resides is a posture. You have the upright, the flexed, and the horizontal. Sit, stand, lie down, 24/7, virtually all your life. Well, there are 3 uncommon postures. Brachiation, hanging from the limbs, upper and lower, turning the body head downward, handstands, shoulder stands, forearm stands, and extension, the opposite of flexion. Well, when Dr. Martin was teaching that stuff by the 80s, extension was contraindicated by the civilian sector, by the Army, everybody. Don't squat, don't lean backward. Here's a whole list of things in 82 that you couldn't do back. They made a list of stuff that sounds absurd today, but that's what he was living in. So he's got these ideas, and they were heretical back then because we weren't doing off the ground training anymore. That all disappeared again by the 60s. So I'm all over it because he's speaking my language. And so I was his student for probably 20 some years till he passed away. I learned all I could about his methods. Well, he created the modern inversion boot and the inversion table. He made them for medical treatment, but his sons convinced him to sell it. He thought it would be good for everybody. So he did, but the medical community turned against him. Physical therapists, chiropractors, osteopath, MDs, they all said your brain will explode, you'll go blind. Nobody should. I've got you read it now and it sounds crazy. Well, there was something to it though, because if you're a society that's spatially disoriented like we were, because we hadn't done this stuff for decades, you're going to make mistakes. And people started to get on the boots and do dumb things. The medical profession said no way. And so his insurance rates went through the roof. He went bankrupt, became a recluse, and died just like many other geniuses, thinking that his life work was a failure. But Roger Teeter, the guy with the beard on Home Shopping Network, he took over, a brilliant engineer. I began to help him, and he built this beautiful machine. So I never stopped teaching it. And I was risking my career every day because if anybody got hurt doing this stuff, then all of my peers would have turned against me and I would have been done. Teaching judo was the same way. They would have said that judo was dangerous because I was doing it on Resolite mats and blah, blah, blah. So there were things I had trouble getting away with. I had to be careful doing this stuff. But so what happened, unfortunately, was that all of Dr. Martin's genius in terms of gymnastics genius, I'm the guy. He taught me. And he never taught anybody else. So when I went down there, it wasn't that I brought boots and a version table. I brought methods, teaching methods. I taught them how to teach, and they felt it. They felt what I felt working with him. My God, I'm in a brand new world, and I feel comfortable in it. All of a sudden, I can do all kinds of cool stuff. Because turning the body upside down does, well, your listeners can go online and see what some of the research says now. It mitigates the damage done from years and years in the common postures. Just as extension mitigates the damage. What's throwing the dead ball overhead is dynamic extension. So and then behind me is a body bridge. It's just horizontal extension. So the idea of leaning backward, the good thing is you can do it now without getting in trouble. Extension is no longer contraindicated. One of the things we found at Benning, I started teaching combat gymnastics down at, when I was with the fitness school, they let me get away with a lot. It was brand new. So I started doing workshops on World War II combat. I learned all of it in the Turner Society. And then I studied in judo and all this stuff. And so I started teaching it again. And right away, I realized I got to really go slowly because most of our guys couldn't do a forward roll. The spines are frozen from sitting hyperflexed. So counterintuitively, then when you sit like that, it's really hard to get the body to make a nice roll. The back's all frozen, the neck's all frozen. So we had to do a lot of extension. I taught them how to get on each other's backs and get on the equipment. Most people say you can't fix an 18 or 20-year-old. I agree with the old timers. No, the body's resilient, but it's got to be done in almost slow motion. It's almost a mystical experience. The last thing, I don't know if you have time, but the thing I would leave your listeners, if you want to go way out to the tip of the sphere, go to the HOPE playlist, HOPE, Heart Optimized Pulmonary Education. This is a system I learned from a World War II combat veteran, homeless guy living in a dump site near my home along the Mississippi River when I was about 9 years old. And that story's online. I'm walking back. They used to come in the summer, the hobos. They'd come in and they'd sleep along the river. There he is, late, and he's got a weight on his stomach. It looked like a piece of mechanical stuff. He's got an old ball between his arms. He's got this diatonic harmonica, and he's making sounds I can only describe as Celtic. But he agreed to teach me. He said, but you can never let anyone hear you. I agreed. He showed me his method. Within a week, I could play music. I would listen to a song. I figured it awakened the muscles which give me breath. It's what's called the epigastric triangle. That weight awakened it. Well, now what do you think? They're using harmonicas for PTSD, COPD. Hospitals are using them. There used to be harmonica orchestras all over the United States up until World War II came. We couldn't get them anymore. And so, we used to issue them to soldiers in World War I in Germany and Great Britain. There's something about what you get out of this forced inhalation, exhalation with these various frequencies, the various keys and tones that under the right conditions can be therapeutic. Well, the hospital has people sitting again, often hyperflexed, which impairs breathing, but they're still saying they're finding results. But this fellow showed me to lay down supine. I put a kettlebell on my epigastric triangle, put a ball between the arm. You start practicing, say, in the key of C. You take a deep breath in, and then you suspend it for a moment. As the other people, your breath will get in sync with the longest breath in the room. You will eventually expand your breath to be, and as that happens, it just gets bigger and bigger. And what happens then is the whole breath expands. The chest expands, everything expands. Then when you lay on a foam roller, everything falls away from the center line. So now you're getting an awakening of the chest as you're lying there. Isn't that interesting?
No, it's super fascinating. I've got to try that.
He showed me all that stuff as a kid. And then when I started teaching it suddenly once again it occurred to me that there are so many powerful things that get lost in history. And all of a sudden when they come back but when you realize why they got lost, and then you realize how easy it is, you think, oh boy. Because look at all the people that are spending big money to go out and find breathing systems. Isn't that interesting?
No, yeah. I'll have to link to that. Hey, Ed, thank you so much for sharing all this wisdom. I think we're going to have to do a part 2 because there's other stuff I want to dig into in your past and some of the other stuff you've done. But I think for the audience right now, we'll leave it at there. I mean, we covered Indian clubs, some physical fitness history, inversion, and then the pulmonary training, which is fascinating. So I'll put links all on the show notes. But thanks so much for coming on. Is there any social media or anything you want to share? I know you have your YouTube site, and I'll put that on there.
No, that's the only thing I do. And you can put the email address if it's somebody that's really serious about the training and such. You can put that on there. I'm pretty good about responding. So, and once again, I sure appreciate what you're doing, and it's good to speak with you again. And best wishes to all the military and law enforcement guys out there.
No. Thanks so much for coming to the show. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode. This episode is again, I thank everybody who's listened to it and stayed with us this long. You know why it's so special to me. Ed's a wealth of information. I learned a lot. I got a page full of notes right here. So hopefully you got something out of it. Be sure to like and subscribe to the episode wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks again for listening to the show.